The Reserve Bank will prepare to undergo its biggest shake-up in decades. A sweeping review into the bank's structure and objectives recommended a range of reforms to be implemented from July next year. They include establishing a new board of monetary policy experts whose main role will be to set the cash rate, reducing the number of rate decisions each year, and improving the bank's communication with the public. The government has accepted all of the review's 51 recommendations. A short time ago, I spoke with one of the nation's leading economists, Ross Garnaut, who recently gave a presentation on the RBA at the Melbourne Economic Forum. I began by asking Professor Garnaut for his broad assessment of the proposed overhaul of the RBA.
I think its big weakness, Karen, is that it doesn't say much about the economics. There's some very light stuff about economic performance, about average performance of Australia being reasonably good over the last 3 decades. But compared with our own history and compared with other developed countries, the performance has been abysmal over the last decade. And I think the review should have started with a realistic assessment of how the economy is going and the contribution of monetary policy to that. The biggest mistake is that from 2013 to 2019, what I call the dog days of economic performance, we kept monetary policy too tight. For a lot of that time, inflation was below the target range. Unemployment was almost as high at the end as it was at the beginning, although the beginning was in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. We didn't get the fall in unemployment that the United States got, that Europe and Japan got. That's abysmal performance. Monetary policy played a big role in that. And my first criticism is that the review should have had more to say about that. And its recommendations on change should have all been built around how can we make sure that that sort of mistake doesn't happen again.
When you refer to those dog days after 2013, with essentially productivity, wages growth not matching even the preceding decades, it's quite stark, that comparison, isn't it?
Yes, in the 90s, on the back of the reforms of the 80s and early 90s, we had the highest productivity growth, total factor productivity in the developed world. During the China resources boom, the decade that followed, roughly 2003 to 2013, we had productivity growth in the middle of the pack. Incomes kept growing quite strongly because we were doing so well out of the China boom. And then in the last decade, we've been right at the bottom of the pack for productivity growth, performing very badly on unemployment. And the pandemic created some complications that will take a while to work through, but the period before the pandemic was a bad one for the average Australian citizen.
Now, with that review not looking at the economics and the economic performance, what's your proposal? In your presentation yesterday, you said a good economy requires a full orchestra with conductor, not a monetary maestro. What do you mean by that?
Monetary policy created some big problems. It gave us unnecessarily high unemployment, quite a lot of it, between 2013 and 2019. But even if we'd had excellent monetary policy, even if we'd had excellent monetary policy better than the rest of the world, we still wouldn't have got good overall economic performance unless we had good coordination of monetary policy with fiscal policy, affecting the competitiveness of industry through the exchange rate and affecting demand, which is so important for full employment and inflation. And that would need to be coordinated with energy policy, immigration policy, with competition policy, trade policy, many other labour policy, many other areas of policy. And we only do well as an economy if somewhere in government you've got effective coordination of policy.
Was there too much expected of the RBA in a sense, that the RBA had assumed a role with calls for higher wages, post-COVID productivity improvement, but it's restricted in terms of what it can deliver on those fronts?
Yes, the Reserve Bank can't solve all of those problems, and that's why you need the orchestra, not a single instrument. But the Reserve Bank didn't do well on monetary policy. We would have had lower unemployment if it had done better, but it alone could not have given us good performance. You need good performances in all those other instruments as well.
Now, Professor Garnaut, when you look at the RBA today, compared to those years where they kept rates too high for too long in your analysis, what do you make of their response right now in an inflationary environment here and abroad?
Well, real cash rates, real after inflation, are not high at the moment. In fact, real cash rates are historically low at the moment. So my critique of the last decade doesn't lead on its own to a statement that today's cash rates are too high. But I think there's reason to be cautious. We've raised rates a lot over a short period of time. There's evidence they're having quite a big effect on economic activity. I don't think it would be responsible to raise them more until we see how that works through. In the end, we will end up with real cash rates that are lower than historical rates, and that's because something big has changed in the world. The tendency around the world for capital to become more abundant, for savings to be a higher proportion of total incomes, investment to be a lower proportion of total incomes. Everywhere, to get full employment with moderate inflation, you need lower real interest rates than earlier in history. That's going on all around the world. We've got to be part of that future if we want full employment with low inflation. Right now, I'd say the lesson of experience is be cautious about increases in rates until we've seen how big the effects of those that have already taken place have been.
Just finally, the review of the RBA looked at a repeal of the government's right to overrule the central bank. What's your reaction to that recommendation? What do you think should happen?
Well, I think that what's in the existing law is pretty good. Menzies passed that law in '59 on advice from the first governor of the central bank after the bank was established, Nugget Coombs. That says that the Reserve Bank makes policy in a lot of areas, and the government can now override it if it thinks that the Reserve Bank's made a mistake. But it won't do that lightly. The law requires, first of all, consultations between the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank, and it'd be good to have them in a more structured way. And if the disagreement isn't resolved, they're resolved in favour of the democratically elected government. But it can't be the Treasurer alone. The law says that the override has to be by the Executive Council through the Governor-General. That's a good process. It requires the government to table in Parliament its reasons for overrule. I don't see good reason for changing that. That part of the arrangements has worked pretty well over the long period it's existed.
Professor Ross Garnaut, I very much appreciate your time as always. Thank you.